Again, welcome to 2023 Theoretical Linguistics at Keio-EMU. Today is a day 5, lecture 5, and once again, I'd like to welcome all of you, but also we are so happy to be with Noam and Daniel, and this week, this 10 days has been wonderful, and this lecture 5 will be another great lecture for sure. Since the time is very limited, again, me and Asako will assist you. That you have the Noam's example in chat box. You can download them. Okay, so I will pass the microphone to Daniel.
Thank you, Hisa. I would like to take just a moment to thank Hisa for this lecture series. Professor Kitahara has been a major figure in the minimalist program from its earliest days, producing now classic work, including the role of merge in the reduction of the transformational component to the phrase structure component, as we discussed last Thursday, his last Wednesday, his work on the derivational approach to syntactic relations and many other topics. I greatly value Hisa's friendship and the collaborative work that EKS has done over these many years. Hisa is deeply committed to the minimalist program, and for furthering that framework, he's a clear and exacting teacher and mentor to the next generation. He's an important contributor and spokesperson and ambassador to the minimalist program. So thank you, Hisa. We really appreciate you.
Thank you very much.
And with that, we are excited to turn the floor over to Professor Noam Chomsky for lecture 5. And Noam, we're ready to go. Thank you.
Okay. Start with an apology. I've received a number of letters from people, but it's been so rushed that I haven't been able to look at them. I'll respond later. Also, a special thanks to Fong, who's miraculously kept my computer functioning while it's continually crashing. If it finishes after this lecture, it's fine. We'll start all over with another computer. Anyway, it made it this far. So I'll start with the usual sermon. The goal is to determine to what extent language is a natural object like others and subject to the Miracle Creed. This goal was formulated loosely 30 years ago, based then on a feeling that enough had been learned to at least place the question on the research agenda, especially with the vast explosion of research within the principles and parameters framework, sometimes called GB, the first framework to suggest what might be a feasible approach to explanatory adequacy. Well, at the time, I should say, I regarded the goal as a guideline for research, not more substantive than that. The one person who disagreed was Sam Epstein, who took it seriously. Now, that led to very precise, quite productive work by his group, known as EKS, later expanded. Now the collective listed in GK, whose work I'm drawing from here. That and other work suggests that Sam might have been right. And that's what I've been exploring in these talks. So in sharpened form, we seek to show that language, particularly I language, is satisfies the principles S and T, and in those terms, and we can approach strong minimalist thesis in crucial cases with limited resource to language-specific conditions, those essential to principle T. More narrowly, we've just been looking at how to achieve the results of successive cyclic movement without the empirical problems that require a very sharp segregation of some kind. and within a more restricted conception of merge that limits it to theta structures in accord with a strict interpretation of T. We'll recall that limiting merge to theta structures has two cases, either the domain or the range, the input or the output has to be a theta structure. The simplest definition of merge automatically yields two subcases, EM and IM. For EM, the output is a theta structure. For IM, the input is. Our immediate concern has been overcoming the problems of successive cyclic movement, other cases that involve IM. So for shorthand, I've just been saying simply that merge applies to theta structures, but remember, that's just shorthand. One language-specific property is duality. There are two systems of interpretation, propositional and clausal. There are some lingering, quite significant open issues that we've discussed about core systems that treat WH movement along with propositional systems. The clausal system is strictly phase related. At each phase, there can be effects in interpretation and in realization of some syntactic object X in the derivation. X is made accessible in some phase Y. X could be Y itself, or it could be a member of Y. We've seen that the simplest system makes the latter choice. X is a member of Y. Y is a two-membered set, XZ, where Z is a phase and X is its specifier, as in 21, first example. Well, in 21, NP1 could be the external argument in a predicate internal subject construction, would therefore be introduced in a theta position by EM, or it could be a WH phrase introduced by IM of NP2, hence in a non-theta position. In either case, NP1 is specifier of the phase 2. Notice that spec is only a notation. The structure is just a two-membered set, symmetrical. I'll continue to use the notation spec for convenience to highlight the case that is of special interest but has no further significance. Well, examination of the very simple construction 21 yields some important conclusions, as we'll see. I'll keep it first to these simple constructions with conclusions in place. I'll then return to more complex ones, illustrating how NP1 reaches its position in 21. Now, that can be a long and intricate process, mirroring successive cyclic movement, but now with no movement, just access to instructions. At the first step of the process, IM leaves a copy, normal way, theta marked, relates in the usual way in externalization. Well, recall that if merge exists, EM and IM come free. We want to show that each applies when and only when it can accord with T. So EM applies to members of the workspace by minimal search that are non-theta structures, and it forms theta structures. IM applies to theta structures, forms non-theta structures. The cases are standard A movement, now reformulated, forming that forms surface subject and shifted object. Second case is sub-extraction, as in IM of the phrase, of which precedence from pictures of which presidents in the matrix position. And thirdly, I am linking the propositional and clausal domains. And these are the cases that keep to principles SMT, hence the only ones we expect to exist. I think that's apparently true. In the I am case, the specifier that's formed lacks a theta role since in the clausal domain. So it's not subject to merge, like spec of info. There's no successive cyclic movement. Well, as Howard mentioned last time in the discussion period, some familiar nomenclature has to be changed, like tough movement, which turns out now to involve EM, not raising to what becomes the surface subject as had earlier been assumed. What we're calling spec is the member of the set that has the properties that interest us. That includes anaphora. That's what I ended with last time with the examples 22. These examples illustrate the dissociation of three basic properties. Theta marking takes place at the lowest phase, not phrase, like which pictures of each other. Anaphora can be determined at any phase. In B and C, it's determined in a medial phase. Realization in the ongoing derivation takes place at the matrix in full movement languages like English. In all cases, the process is determined by spec of the lowest phase. So the three basic properties are dissociated. We want to deal with these phenomena without successive cyclic movement. Close look raises some interesting questions about what constitutes a phase. So let's take a look at that, then come back to the examples. Now, the questions arise about the status of the predicate internal subject, the external argument in a verb phrase, again, as in 21. Next one. The question that arises is, which is the phase? Is it the brackets 1 or the brackets 2? There are reasons for each of these choices. If it's 2, then the notion of accessibility at higher phases is very simple, just keeps to spec of a phase. There are other simplifications to which I'll return. If it's 1, then all theta roles are assigned within the phase, including the external argument. Actually, that's been the normal practice, taking 1 to be the phase. But notice that even under this assumption, the distinction between the two options is still maintained by distinguishing the interior 2 of the phase, so-called escape hatch, from the full phase. They behave differently. So the two alternatives are not really that different. For now, I'll take the phase itself to be 2, and I'll call 1 the extended phase. They both function. Suppose that NP2 in 21 is a WH phrase. Then whatever choice we make about the phase, it will raise to NP1 and be boxed before the external argument is introduced by external merge. That much follows simply from the general cyclicity of operations. Internal merge is entirely internal to bracket 2 in 21. EM is external to it. Notice that that's the opposite of the standard assumption, which has been that WH movement is external to the extended phase. Now, that was a mistake, given the general cyclicity principle of derivation. It also introduces complications, since it would be no longer true to say that it's spec of a phase that's accessed for instructions at higher phases. So the principled form turns out to be the simpler one. Well, with this much in place, let's go back to 22. Which pictures of each other do the men like? Which pictures of each other do the men hope Bill likes? Printing error. Which pictures of each other did Mary think that the men hoped Bill likes? Well, let's take case A more fully, 23. That's just spelling it out with the structure. W is which pictures of each other. I bold face the W, that's the element relevant for anaphora. In this case, it also is the boxed element, spect of the lower phase 3. 2, notice, is still within the phase. 1 is the extended phase. 1 is the standard CC configuration for anaphors, so the right interpretation is produced directly within the extended phase. Well, let's turn to case B. More fully, that would be 24. Which pictures of each other do the men hope Bill likes? And deleting which pictures of each other. Again, the bold-faced W is what's relevant for anaphor. Now it happens to be in a medial phase. Phase 4 consults spec of 3, that's W, for instructions, and it inserts its copy, bold-faced W. As in case A, the extended phase 1 is the standard configuration for anaphors, so that yields the correct interpretation. We can take the information to be assigned to its copy in 2. So the lowest phase, 2, contains the information about anaphora, as well as about the theta role of W, all collected in one place for CI, lower phase here. Recall that PIC doesn't apply in the clausal domain. PIC is a condition on structure building. You don't do that in the clausal domain. Case C is the same with regard to anaphora. The matrix phase, again, consults spec of 3 for instructions. In this case, it introduces W into the continuing derivation. Here, its interior is accessible to merge. That would be the case of subextraction discussed earlier. In English, introduction into the derivation happens only at the matrix. There are other languages where there may be effects in the derivation at medial phases. Note that, like merge, anaphora also has access to the interior of the phase. That's as we would expect. Interior of the phase is not boxed, so accessible to merge, accessible to anaphora. Well, that's the general idea. More precise version is pretty straightforward. I won't bother with it. Nothing new is added. All the steps are as expected. Interpretation of the spec phase in the successive movement approach is reinterpreted here in terms of access to the closest phase in the derivation. Its spec determines the interpretation. The results, both at CI and SM, fall out automatically from what seems to be an optimal version of I-language externalization. We don't have anything to say, need nothing. We can forget about segregation, no need to say anything about that. The problems of successive cyclic movement that don't arise. Well, let's have a closer look now at some sample derivations. So let's start with derivation of guess who Bill thinks that John saw. Begins with 25. Who saw who? Yeah, that's the beginning, the first relevant step. So we continue with the simplest assumptions. The brackets 1 are the full phase. 2 is the extended phase. The first step is internal merge of Hu2, the object of C, that yields 25. Still within the V star P phase. Sorry, it's not the extended phase. Still within the V star P phase, though Hu is specifier of bracket 1, hence accessible for instructions at higher phases. Hu sub 1 goes into the box. Its copy Hu sub 2 is interpreted as direct object. Externalization is activated. It deletes by the universal economy-based rule. There's no need for a special marking in the I language, del or something like that, for what is to be deleted, as was proposed in earlier versions. Well, that concludes the phase 2. Phase theory renders 2 inaccessible to merge as the derivation proceeds. The next step is external merge of John, picks up the theta role that's assumed by the VP bracket 1. That's followed by external merge of info, internal merge of John to spec of info, external merge of the complementizer C, closes the phase, yields 26. Well, notice, however, that 26 is incomplete. The Q feature of Hu is not valued. Well, we can now proceed freely to internal merge theta marked Hu2, not non-theta marked Hu1. So we theta marked it Hu2, we can therefore internal merge it. We raise it to spec of 26, that yields 27. Still the problem, the Q feature of WH is not valued. More is needed, number of possibilities. One is to extend the derivation to 28. You can, I won't bother reading. The Q feature of Hu is now valued by C/Q, C with the feature Q, that consults the boxed element Hu sub 1, specifier of the CP phrase, for instructions. Instructions assign scope, introduce Hu into the derivation, that yields 29. Guess who Bill thinks Bill sees, John sees. Under externalization, all occurrences of Hu in 28 delete in local CC configurations along the way. Well, compare 25 with 30. In 30, John is theta marked by the VP. On the surface, it looks as though 25 and 30 should behave the same way, but of course they don't. The reason is timing. In 25, WH movement is within the VP phase. Yields 2, but it's keeping within the same phase. And nothing has to be said about PIC or where it occurs. Phase theory alone dictates that once a phase is completed, it's no longer accessible to structure building operations. That's plausibly a general third factor economy principle. In 30, external merge of John 1, takes place in the next phase. So accordingly, the two occurrences of John are repetitions, not copies. That contrasts with 31, unaccusative, in which the two occurrences are copies, single phase, lower one deletes under externalization in the normal way. Same is true quite generally as in, say, 32. Most people believe most people to be honest. Most people try to be honest. under externalization. In A, as we've discussed, there are two phases, so repetitions. In B, with only a single phase, there are copies. The same distinctions hold for the VP phase analog object raising. Examples are discussed in GK. I won't repeat them. Notice that these accounts adopt the simpler version of phase theory, taking the phase to exclude the external argument. We've seen, however, that the extended phase with the external argument present does function elsewhere, as in anaphora. Taking the extended phase as the actual phase would cause problems. We'd lose the simple account of the cases just reviewed in terms of timing. It would be necessary to introduce the edge interior distinction with a rule imposing PIC after internal merge, but before external merge of the external argument. We would also lose the simple description of accessibility in terms just of members of the phase. So there's therefore motivation for both notions of phase. One is relevant to anaphora, the other to merge and the copy relation. We've seen, however, that anaphora doesn't observe phase structure, as in many people hurt themselves. It's distinct from the ungrammatical many people hurt, meaning that many people hurt many people, or such sentences as the men thought it is quite strange that it has been claimed that pictures of each other were exhibited in the National Gallery, where it goes way into lower phases. Come back to the matter briefly. Pure interpretation, not phase limited. Let's have a look at the sentence 33A, which has the structure B. Who does it seem ate the sandwich? Well, a question arises. In externalization, how is who to, the lower one, how's that deleted? Look, deletion under externalization operates cyclically in the normal fashion. The extended phase, number one, is formed in the usual way. That's number one, and B there. It's formed in the usual way. Then who to raises to who one. Deletion then eliminates who to by the usual economy principle. Next relevant step is at the matrix. CQ, C with the feature Q, seeks instructions from spec of the phase. That's who to, not who one. But there's a problem. Who to has been eliminated by deletion. We have to make some changes. What's needed is a refinement of the notions deletion and structurally identical. We have to distinguish two kinds of I-language properties, as in 34. We have that. There are I-language features that lead to CI. There are other language features that are restricted to externalization. So if you take a lexical item, formal and semantic features are in category A. And phonological features, some morphological features are in category B. We now redefine structurally identical, as in 35. Here, X and Y are structurally identical if they're identical in category A Well, deletion eliminates only category B features, doesn't affect category 1 features, A features. X and Y, therefore, can be structurally identical when one of them lacks category B features, while the other one keeps it. They're not identical, but they're non-distinct. Well, returning to 33, who does it seem ate the sandwich? Deletion eliminates the category B properties of who sub 2, but it leaves its category A properties unaffected. There's still a problem. At the matrix, CQ, category B features are accessed. They're not there. They're gone in who 2. They remain in who sub 1, but they're not in who sub 2, which is the one that's accessed at the matrix. That requires a slight modification of the notion of access, not distinguishing copy pairs. So with this in place, what happens is C/Q accesses who sub 2, doesn't find any phonological features, takes the next step. It finds, looks for the copy of the spec phase that has the full instructions. That's spec info, who sub 1. So who is then introduced at C/Q, and it deletes spec info in the usual way. So we got rid of who sub 2 by just the cyclic operations of deletion, revising the notion of structurally identical and access very slightly. You can compare this with 6 and 7 from a couple of days ago. Bill met yesterday. Number 6, 7 is the structure, 8 spells it out. Here, Bill sub 4 is an undeleted repetition. That contrasts with who sub 2 in 33, where it's deleted non-repetition. I won't run through it, but leave it to you. If you work through the two of them, you'll see they come out as expected. They look similar, but they're different with regard to cyclicity. Well, notice I've kept away from distributed morphology. At least in its stronger forms, it raises questions to which I haven't heard answers, so I'll put it aside. You've probably thought of a problem about the idea that an aphora can go arbitrarily deep. What about sentences like 36? The men that Mary likes pictures of each other. That's plainly unacceptable. We might deal with it by introducing some notion of closest antecedent. But there actually is another possibility. Maybe it is grammatical, but unacceptable for some independent reason, perhaps a processing consideration that prefers closer antecedents. Notice that can't be ruled out a priori. Data don't come with their explanations on their sleeves. Data are always interpreted theory internally. Structure of the theory determines how you interpret the data. So let's take a standard example. Take, say, illusions, like the moon illusion. The data determine that the moon is large when it rises, but it gets smaller as time proceeds. If you're doing what's now called pure data science, that would yield this prediction. It says the moon's large when it rises, gets smaller, gets larger again when it sets. Well, that's of course wrong. Theory internal considerations lead us to reinterpret the data, as is always done, even though there isn't yet a satisfactory theory. Apparently not very simple. But even in the absence of a full explanation, we discard the data. That's normal. Maybe the same is true of 36. Maybe some as yet unknown richer theory might show that possibility can't be ruled out a priori. And similar considerations arise with all data. I'll return to this question. Putting the option aside here, it's a lot of consequences. Well, let's return to the quest to discover the nature of the most significant property of humans, language, which is at the root of why humans are the uniquest of all, as Chomsky put it. We've seen that speck of info is in an anomalous position. It's similar in some, but not all respects, to the specifier of a phase. It seems that raising the spec in full is an ancillary operation, hanging off on the side. It's actually plausible. The structure is an outlier in the system. It's phase internal, it's related to EPP, to labeling, other than the secondary semantic rules. Actually, the VP counterpart also has anomalous behavior. There are the problems about optionality that Howard Lasnik has discussed carefully, problems that don't arise in the subject case. There are also problems about the secondary semantic role as de re or de dicto interpretation. That's less clear than we'd like it to be for de re and de dicto altogether. So it looks kind of anomalous, maybe just an outlier. There may be now a kind of a handle on observations of Luigi Rizzi's years ago about externalization effects of successive cyclicity. A lot of such effects. I mentioned some of them last time. Well, as Luigi pointed out, you don't get these effects at the first raising operation, only later ones. Possibility, René Huybregts suggested, is that at the first and only application of IM raising of WHXP to spec of VP, only then and only then the operation accessing the box is vacuous in that it has just been implemented. So you don't get spelling out. At later phases, accessing the boxed element is not vacuous in this sense. There's another problem with successive cyclic movement that seems to be overcome in the box system, also pointed out by René. That has to do with partial WH movement. It's a topic that was studied particularly by Dana McDaniel in a 1989 paper on the phenomenon, some German dialects. With successive cyclic movement and such expressions as 37, there's a labeling violation at the bracket labeled 2. It's not in the criterial position. Bracket label 1, T is the variable copy of WXP, no way to label it. Well, that problem doesn't arise in the box theory. At bracket labeled 2, the boxed WHXP is accessed, and under externalization, it's spelled out. No labeling problem, since the phrase does not enter the derivation. It appears only in externalization. Notice I'm making an assumption here that the medial phrase is not available for sub-extraction. I haven't checked, but can easily be tested. and seems to hold. I suspect you can check it. Some further interest, if it does, that would then explain this entire problem. Well, at the matrix position, bracket of sub 1, the scope of WXP is determined for CI, and VOS, kind of an expletive, is spelled out under externalization. Actually, these cases of media spell out are of quite considerable interest. There are restrictions on what can be spelled out at the medial position. Same is true of Italian, according to Massimo Piatelli, maybe more broadly. Ross Thornton has shown that young children acquiring English produce such expressions and do so with the same restrictions. So what it seems is that children are exploring the range of possible languages permitted by UG. They still don't have enough information to show that the language of their community doesn't allow these options. It fits well with Charles Yang's approach to language acquisition and with what's known about how infants quickly zero in on detailed phonetics of the ambient languages. These are more topics worth pursuing and strongly support the idea that UG functions strongly in language acquisition. Well, let's take a look at a more complex expression. 38. I'll skip a lot of details, keep to essentials. So 38 is, guess which book John told Bill. Lost him. Guess which book. So, sorry, losing my place. Guess which book John told Bill that you asked whether the man who Mary met wanted to read. Complicated, but good sentence. There are several steps. I'll go through the relevant ones. For convenience, I'll put the boxed elements in italics. One preliminary step is to form the noun phrase 39. The man who Mary met, who deletes under externalization. As you know, there are a number of ideas about how to form 39, but we can put them aside. However, it's formed by raising the man, external merge, doesn't matter here. Well, next step is to introduce 39 into the derivation. That's going to yield 40. The man who Mary met wanted to read the book. The Q features of which book are still unvalued. So we have to proceed as we did before, forming 41. I'll skip intermediate steps. Which book you asked whether the man who Mary met wanted to read. Still unvalued features. So we have to extend the derivation further. We can do so unproblematically to 38. More fully, that's 42. Guess which book John told Bill that you asked whether the man who Mary met wanted to read. All work straight. Now consider the slightly different sentence, 43. Guess which book the man read was happy. We have happy down below instead of which book. Okay. Well, that's a subjacency violation. The lower occurrence of which book cannot be raised by internal merge to the boxed position. So it cannot be consulted by matrix, the matrix C/Q. C/Q looks down, there's no information in the spec position. That's the counterpart of no escape hatch in successive cyclic movement. This holds more generally. The constraints on internal merge, that give the various island conditions in the standard version, they're carried over to the box system, though differently stated. Well, let's turn to something else. The set formation operation, FS. Sorry about the dog. That's the free operation available for all inquiry. FS applies to the workspace. It forms the set Z, the set X1 to XN. XI comes out of the workspace by minimal search. One option is that N equals 2, but that's not a case of merge, as we discussed earlier. Whatever the choice of N, the derivation will crash unless some process inserts it into the derivation. In GK, there are two cases discussed. Examples 44. John, 44A, John lived in Kansas near a farm. John lived in Kansas on a farm near a river. B, John lived in Kansas on a farm and near a river. The two differ in several respects. Case A is a single event. The farm and the river are in Kansas. Case B, the three phases are independent. Could be that John lived in Kansas, then he moved to a farm in Iowa, then he went on to Cambridge near a river. In A, raising is possible. There are some matching constraints. They may or may not be grammatical. They may just be stylistic. In B, raising is barred completely by the coordinate structure constraint. Probably reduces to inviolable matching conditions, as discussed in GK. In both cases, order is imposed in externalization, but here we depart from GK, which didn't notice that there is no ordering unless some such phrase as respectively or one after the other or something like that is used. So in 45, there's no ordering. Tom, Dick, and Harry danced and sang all night, all kinds of possibilities. And not only is there no ordering, there is no set of conjuncts that expresses the meaning of 45. No account in terms of conjunction reduction. Furthermore, the ordering that's imposed by phrases like respectively can hold beyond sentence boundaries, as in 46. John and Bill are good friends. They even write joint papers. They live in New York and California, respectively. In short, ordering's a discourse property. It's not part of sentence grammar. It's a matter, did a lot of work on it. It was reviewed about 30 years ago in a paper by Dalrymper and Kaler, 1999, I think. We can dispense with the rule form sequence in GK. Compound and independent events, as discussed in GK, they're still distinguished, but simply by the choice of the position of merge of the conjunction. That's important. Form sequence was the one case in GK that was not easily accommodated within the strong minimalist thesis. So we can now get rid of it. There are sharp differences between sentence grammar and discourse grammar. They're sometimes overlooked. So in the literature, it's been suggested that the well-worn example 47 might be paraphrased by the discourse 48. 47, ship was sunk to collect the insurance. Discourse 48, the ship was sunk The goal was to collect the insurance. They sound as if they're saying the same thing, but they're not. There's nothing wrong with the discourse. 49. The ship was sunk. That's unfortunate. The goal was to collect the insurance, which is only for damages. That's perfectly fine. 47 doesn't say that. Quite generally, sentence grammar has rigid properties, which are not captured by discourse. Well, within sentence grammar, sets that are formed by form set are introduced into derivations in the position of single XPs. So we might ask whether a single XP should be regarded as the limiting case. A single XP should be a singleton set, might ask. That would mean that in John left, both John and leave might be understood as the minimal case of a set. There hasn't been much inquiry into how this might work. That's another issue that might be looked at more carefully. It does make sense to think of it that way. Well, turn to another topic. The discussion here and in all the work that's presupposed has been limited to I language. Only a few side comments on externalization. Well, the first step in proceeding beyond I language would be to consider the transition from I language to externalization. We might expect that that operation would conform to the guiding principle T of I language, since it still involves I language. And in important ways, it actually does. So the central property of externalization, whatever the sensory motor modality, is linearization. Notice that's only partial for sign, which can use options that are made available by visual space. I've been assuming that linearization is a condition imposed by the non-linguistic sensory motor systems. That seems plausible. One way in which linearization observes the principle T is that the non-theta causal system is external to the theta-based propositional system. So in that respect, linearization does conform to the principle T. Another property of linearization is that it's to the left. There's a left periphery, there's no right periphery. Could be that that's a matter of pragmatic or processing considerations, which are permitted to enter into externalization, though not in the I language, the pure language. Well, what about the anomalous case, spec of info and its VP correlate? With regard to linearization, they fall together with the causal system. Spec is to the left. Notice there's no hierarchical reason for this. So you look at the spec info P structure, symmetric. Spec C commands the terms of info P and conversely. So no hierarchical reason for the left-right order. Could be, though, that it's the same linearization principle. Broad linearization principle then could be that all the non-theta elements, not just those of the causal domain, are on the left. Maybe pragmatic processing motivation akin to the linearization processes that tend to keep heavy structures to the right. Doesn't plausibly fit in I language. These are considerations that enter into externalization, not, we're assuming I language, pure language. Well, at this generalization, at this very general level, there's one question still left open. Linearization of head complement. That's forced, it's a mismatch between CI, which has no ordering, and SM, which requires ordering. At the CI level, V object, object V have the same interpretation, same with other cases. At the SM level, they have to be distinguished. That's true for all heads. There seems to be no general principle, at least within the domain of this discussion, that provides an answer. Well, as you know, that's been the topic of considerable debate. Richie Kane has provided ingenious empirical arguments in support of a universal VO base order. Others have argued for an OV universal order. Whatever the answer, if there's a universal order, that would seem to be the only case violating the general conclusion that ordering is imposed by sensory motor conditions and is missing from I language and CI interpretation, where it plays no role. In fact, it can't be there for reasons we've discussed. Furthermore, all such approaches involve considerable recourse to internal merge in ways that are not permitted in the framework we've been disconstructing. Well, I'll leave that open here. Just one final set of comments of a more general kind of methodological nature. I think they're worth thinking about. So no more examples. We've been considering some pretty exotic expressions, the kind you'll rarely, if ever, find in a corpus. Examples like these are typically the kind that yield the deepest insight into the nature of language. Actually, that's a normal expectation in science, back to its origins. And in the history of science, it's often been misunderstood. So think of Galileo at the creation of modern science. The funders in those days were the aristocrats. What they wanted was accounts of the things that mattered in life. Growth of flowers, storms and droughts, and so on. Galileo had to work hard to convince them that it was worth studying exotic cases, like balls rolling down frictionless planes, which can't even exist. So very exotic. Or a ball falling from the top of a mast of a moving sailboat. Any actual experiment would have produced chaos, not the discovery that it'll fall at the base of the mast, as thought experiments showed. And in fact, many of the most important experiments described in Galileo's work were thought experiments. Actually, that remains true up until today, like the question what the world would look like to someone traveling at the speed of light, or Schrödinger's cat. It's the exotic cases that have quite regularly led to scientific advances, and that's to be expected. They study systems in their purest forms and at their limits. In fact, every serious experiment is an attempt to construct exotic cases by abstracting from the many variables that interact to yield ordinary experience. In linguistics, that's something one learns in a freshman course in field methods. So you don't just ask your informants, is this sentence okay? The response may be incorrect for all sorts of reasons. Maybe the informant just didn't pay sufficient attention. Maybe it's a society where politeness is the norm. So informants may just say yes. It's actually experiences I've had myself in informant courses. What to do is use elicitation techniques to determine the actual status and interpretation of experiments. That's very common in all of our work, including when we're using ourselves as informants. Actually, we came across an example of that here a couple of days ago when I failed to see the full complexity of the sentence. The book is impossible for John to understand. And Howard had to use elicitation techniques to help me reach the answer that I knew, but didn't see right off. Often, we don't see what we know right off. In fact, sometimes it takes considerable context and prodding to bring to awareness what we actually know, but can't see. A familiar example is the sentence, John had a book stolen. It's discussed in aspects. It's 3 ways ambiguous, but that's not obvious. Even skilled professionals have to work hard to try to find the 3 interpretations. Although if you give the proper context, it's immediately obvious. Well, I mentioned these truisms as they should be because they're often forgotten. So take the common practice of justifying some judgment about a language, including one's own language, by searching some huge corpus and finding an actual example. Doesn't make a lot of sense. That's the worst kind of informant work. You don't know anything about the circumstances in which the example was produced. You don't know whether the writer had thought it through. You don't even know whether the writer produced it purposely in order to violate rules, which is often quite a respectable practice. One's own intuitive judgments are far more reliable than searching through a corpus, although even these require elicitation procedures. There are many other cases of this. Some of them are quite harmful. Just take the current excitement about large language models, chatbots and the like. Some of what's being said about them is astonishing. Out of politeness, I'll omit names. Renowned figures in the field issue grand pronouncements about how the chat series achieves the long-sought goal of modern linguistics, to account for how people talk to each other. Of course, it doesn't. But furthermore, no one has been insane enough to propose such a ridiculous goal. Couldn't occur to anybody who's not mesmerized by data science. Other leading figures pronounce proudly that these systems have solved the problem of language acquisition. They've shown that behaviorism was really right. You can find that in the main text on deep learning systems. Well, so the idea is you throw some supercomputers at 50 terabytes of data using 1 trillion parameters. You can find statistical regularities that can be used to predict pretty well the next likely word in a sequence. String them together, it yields something that looks more or less like what you find in the astronomical data set. Does that help understand how a 2-year-old observes structure dependence, or how we interpret the sentences we're using here as examples? Well, the answer would be, who cares? Those are all exotic cases. So it doesn't matter, just as it doesn't matter what happens to a ball rolling down a frictionless plane. It's in fact trivially obvious that the large language models can tell you nothing about language, cognition, learning, anything else. Very simple reason. They work just as well for impossible languages that violate all the rules as for actual languages. So they're sort of like a theory of physics that predicts many things that happen, many things that can't possibly happen, and makes no distinction among them. And the better the systems become at dealing with actual languages, the worse they are. The more clear it will be, the more clear will be the irremediable flaw, since by the same token, they'll be better at impossible languages that people can't acquire, except maybe as puzzles. I kind of guess that we're approaching the day when some immense system will study leaves blowing in the wind and derive something roughly similar to Newton's laws. It'll surely give a better prediction of the next stage than can be given by most advanced physical theories. We'll have very excited articles in the journals about how we've transcended physics. Well, in fact, that day may not be remote. A friend of mine who's a physicist sent me an article with disbelief, an article that actually appeared in a physics journal by a physicist who's enamored with the fashionable data sciences. He suggested the theories are unnecessary. We carry out studies of astronomical amounts of data. We subject them to detailed statistical analysis. We provide predictions of what's likely to happen. Data in, predictions out. Who needs theories? Let's get rid of Newton's laws and just study leaves blowing in a wind. Well, the hard sciences are well enough established so that there's probably no impact of any of this. The emerging sciences are much more vulnerable, and that happens to be where the money is. So they may be seriously impaired, very seriously, in fact. It's a very serious problem for the future of linguistics and other emerging sciences. These are more matters that it's worth thinking about as we pursue exotic examples, those that press the system to its limits and therefore teach us something, instead of just pointlessly reproducing what's often observed. That also bears on a question raised earlier about interpretation of data, always theory-laden, just like the moon illusion, never just pure, at least in anything remotely like serious inquiry. Well, a really final comment. We've been considering ways of improving, refining earlier work, eliminating some standard mechanisms and assumptions and the problems that come with them. Needless to say, there's a vast terrain to explore to determine how much of language can be incorporated within this extremely parsimonious framework approaching SMT. It does seem, however, that we can, to quote Wheeler again, we can at least perceive the glimmer of a central idea, so simple, so beautiful, so compelling, that someday, when we grasp it, we will all say to each other, "Oh, how could it have been otherwise?" That's for the day for you to reach.
Thank you, Noam. All right, so we'll open the floor to questions and comments. Howard?
Yeah. There seem to be some well-studied phenomena in language that are truly, how should I put it, unbounded. Don't care about islands, don't care about subjacency, things like pronouns as bound variables. And they do seem to be part of I language because they require C command. Similarly, condition C is about C command, and it's truly unbounded. You get the effect even into islands. I'm wondering what your thoughts are about that.
My guess is that this is discussed somewhat in GK, distinguishing C command from the condition C from the others. My guess is that this is true generally of purely interpretive rules, like an aphora. Maybe they're all not part of the structure building system. So therefore, they just don't observe the conditions of structure building, basically internal merge.
Mm-hmm.
That has to be shown, but they have the same flavor. And I think it's worth looking at. And that brings up the kinds of cases I mentioned, like they think that Mary likes each other. Maybe that is grammatical. Maybe it's maybe it's like the moon illusion. You look at the moon illusion; it's perfectly obvious that the moon is larger at the when it rises. There's no explanation for that, but it's universally rejected. Well, maybe this is the same situation, not physics, but an emerging system, something to think about. And I think that bears on condition C, which may belong to this other system, which is intuitively where it belongs.
Mm-hmm.
Amelia?
Hi. Yeah, I had a question about example 33, about the one that still goes, who does it seem ate the sandwich? The example has it gets to a point where C must carry out a minimal search procedure to locate the fuller copy of the element at spec B star P. And when it locates that copy at spec in full, does this deletion of the element come from phase instructions, since C command copy relations aren't formed between box positions and the derivation, as demonstrated by the sentence that Bill likes that you showed earlier?
Well, let's run through 33. Look at B. You form the lowest thing, who ate the sandwich. Add in full. Raise who 2 to who 1. Suppose we're in the externalization system. Well, in that case, you delete the lower element, who 2, because it's in a relation. It's the C command relation, one of the permissible relations. So it's gone. When you get to CQ, you have a problem. You can't access who 1 because who 1 is not theta related. You're supposed to access who 2, but in the externalization system, who 2 is gone. Well, that leads to the changes that I suggested. We think more carefully about the nature of the features in a system. They actually fall into 2 classes. One of them is not relevant to externalization. In lexical item, the formal features, semantic features, so-called, not relevant to externalization. The phonological features are not relevant to CI. So they're 2 different classes. Suppose that we now change the notion of structurally identical to mean to be structurally identical, you have to have the same formal and semantic features, but you don't care about the others. You can be non-distinct. So one element, one form can have them and the other cannot have them. They're still structurally identical as far as the internal language is concerned, the CI system. Then we're almost okay. When we delete who 2 under externalization, we only delete the phonological features, the ones relevant to externalization. We leave the others that are relevant to interpretation. That's exactly the way it should be. Now we're halfway there. Let's go back to CQ. CQ searches. It now can find who 2 because it has features. but it doesn't have the phonological features that are needed to introduce it into the derivation at the matrix. So what it does is look at the copy of who2, namely who1. So access looks at copy pairs. Slight change, perfectly reasonable. CQ accesses who sub 2, no phonological features. It has formal semantic features, so it can access it. Doesn't have the phonological features it needs, so it looks on to who sub 1. There you have the phonological features, didn't delete. Okay, fine. Then as the interpreter spells it out at CQ, you get who does it seem, 8th sandwich. The top who just deletes in the normal way. Compare this with 6, 7, and 8. They look kind of similar, but they behave differently. I didn't run through the details. I left it as an exercise, but if you run through it, they see that they behave differently. So that sharpens the notions of structurally identical. It separates the two categories of features the way they ought to be separated, and it slightly modifies access so it looks at copy pairs instead of just a single member of the copy. Does that deal with the question you raised?
So just to clarify, the deletion process doesn't occur from a regular like C command relation between the box position and the element spec info, but yeah, okay.
See, deletion is just, remember, it's happening in the externalization system, which is dumb, doesn't know anything. It just looks at the forms, doesn't care what they are. And when it sees a pair, a structurally identical pair that are related, which reduces to C command, when it sees that, it just deletes the lower one. That's the general economy condition. Says do as little work as you can in externalization.
Okay. Thank you.
Takanori?
Hello. I'd like to ask if dislocation and hierarchical structure is unified and merged. In the standard theory, the dislocation and hierarchical structure was unified since they are possible instances of merge, IM and EM. However, it seems to me that the box theory does not provide unification, since dislocation is a consequence of access from C head, not internal merge to C spec. Do you hear me?
So we're looking at what happens in the matrix position.
Yes.
The C position. There are two kinds of cases. There is, take topicalization. Just a fact, there is topicalization that isn't by movement. There's one form of topicalization. That guy, I really like the fellow very much. You can have idioms there. Okay, that's, you can have, I forget what they're called, but you can put a whole phrase there. That guy, I really like the fellow very much. No movement. That's one kind. There is a thesis on this if you're interested. The other kind has real movement and observes all the island conditions. Those are two different categories. The first kind will be external merge, right up at the matrix position. Doesn't affect the sentence at all. The second kind will be presumably just the ordinary approach, either the old approach is successive cyclic movement, now rephrased in terms of access to the specifier of the phase. But they are two different things. Forgotten the name that's used for the first kind, the things that are left behind.
They're sometimes called anaphoric epithets.
Epithets, yeah, called epithets. And I also, escapes me the person who wrote the thesis on it, forgotten it. Priti Patel wrote a thesis on it some years ago, going through the nature of the epithets and where they appear. I don't know if it was ever published.
If there is no movement, it seems to me that there is no unification of IM and dislocation and hierarchical structure, which was a major consequence of the standard theory. If dislocation is a consequence of access from C and externalization, we don't have a unified of structural building.
Well, it depends which case you're talking about. One of the cases doesn't have dislocation. The case of the external merge case, where you get the epithets, there's no dislocation.
Typicalization like
and there you can have any kind of sentence that violates all kind of islands. Doesn't matter. The dislocation case has to come from internal merge. No way external merge can give a dislocation.
Double H movement.
Well,
Dislocation.
There is some movement. One step to link the two steps. Later, you get movement and things like sub-extraction. And of course, you also get it in the spec infill cases, the A movement cases. But those are the cases where internal merge is permitted by the way the principle T works. And those seems to be the ones you get. What we want to show is that you get the effects of internal merge exactly where they're permitted by T and nowhere else. And it would be nice to show you get them in all the cases where you're permitted. This goes back to the question of the general question of the enabling function of strong minimalist thesis. It has, again, as I said before, it has a disciplinary effect. It says you can't do a lot of things. A lot of things you might want to do, you can't do. That's to the good. You get better explanations that way. But it also says there are some things you can do. And it would be interesting to see if, so for example, it says you can have obligatory control. You can have the form set cases. You can have the other kinds of things we've been talking about. You can get sub-abstraction. Interesting question is whether, to what extent languages use all the possibilities they have. Actually, Mark Baker has some forthcoming work, isn't out yet. He's given talks about it, in which he tries to show that if you look at the the languages he looks at, so-called exotic languages, you find that they use things that exploit the possibilities of UG, even if you don't directly find them in the usual languages we study. I mean, there are actually some examples of this we've come across in our own recent history. So take Vergniaud's proposals about case theory, arguing that English, say, has basically the Latin system, just doesn't show up. By now, there's a lot of work on things like that, showing that actually one of the most dramatic cases is, I may have mentioned it, Julie Legate's work on Welpery. Welpery was, which Ken studied, Ken Hale, was the typical case, the extreme case of a language with no linear order, with any arbitrary linear order. Ken and Julie showed that You look at a deeper level, has the same properties as other languages, but you don't see them right away. Got to look at deeper examples. That's the kind of thing we'd like to show. Actually, it's the same kind of thing that's going on in biology for the last 50 years or so, interestingly. So you go back to the 1950s. In linguistics, it was assumed, it was a principle, stated, in fact, you have to look at each language on its own, can't use other languages, can't bring in other languages, because any language, a language can be arbitrary, can be anything. So therefore, each case has to be looked at on its own. Pretty much the same assumption was made in biology. The assumption was organisms are so diverse, so varied in their properties, that you have to look at each one on its own without relation to the others. The last 50 or 60 years of biology have shown that that's totally wrong. In fact, it seems that the life forms that emerged from the Cambrian explosion 500 billion years ago are basically all the same. They look very different to us, but if you look more deeply at them, they have the same fundamental features, same basic forms. In fact, it's even been proposed that there might be a universal genome. Not proven, but it's taken seriously. Universal genome with some slight modifications here and there give you the difference between one or another life form, yeast and humans. Just fiddle around with a few things in the analog of universal grammar, the universal genome. Well, we're getting to see something like that in language. Things that looked totally different, even recently, like Walpurgis versus English, seem to be pretty much the same. In fact, if you go back to the 1970s, one of the main people working on this topic was Ken Hale, in fact. Early 70s, Ken proposed that there's got to be a parameter for free word order. And it was assumed at that time that languages like German and Japanese would be free word order. Well, since been discovered that they have rigid word order, but only when you look at much more intricate things than structural linguists were looking at. So I think we may find out that there really are deep uniformities that just slight variations from. There's another similarity between what's happened in biology and what I think is going on in linguistics, which might be worth some thought. You go back again, mid-20th century, it was pretty much assumed by biologists that diversity of organisms and nature of organisms is determined by natural selection. And it was, there's a line in Darwin, which is often quoted, in which he says that all changes must, this is origin of species, all changes must be very slight. He says, if it's ever discovered that changes aren't slight, my whole theory collapses. It was a strong statement. That was pretty much believed in the mid-20th century. A lot of people who work on topics like evolution of language still believe it. It's not believed in biology anymore. By now, it's known that very slight changes in the genome can make changes of enormous surface of change. Gave a couple of examples before, like the most striking example is the formation of complex cells. Apparently, what happened, anything but bacteria or archaeons, one-celled organisms, what seems to have happened is, by accident, one microorganism swallowed another, led to a totally different structure. Nature had to come along and do something about it, turned into eukaryotic cells. Same seems to be true about mitochondria, give the energy of a cell. Apparently, again, just swallowing an organism by accident. Apparently, the same thing is true of vision. There's a lot of work by originally Walter Gehring showed that you can account for all visual systems, maybe all systems that use light, go back to some accident where a particular molecule just happened to be absorbed by a cell, an opsin molecule, which turns light into electrical energy. And that's why we have vision and photosynthesis and so on, maybe. These things happen all the time. Darcy Thompson, who did the classic work on this, was pretty much neglected for a long time, not so much anymore. Alan Turing, who's founded computer science pretty much, is an theory of computation, also did work on what's called morphogenesis, finding how patterns in structures in organisms are determined simply by physical and chemical laws. Stripes of a zebra, for example. That work was neglected for a long time, but it's now being taken more seriously. That's pretty analogous to the way we're beginning to use principles of computational efficiency, laws of nature, in trying to explain the apparent diversity and complexity of language. There is some parallel between the way the two subjects have developed for the last half century or so.
Thank you very much.
So, Mamoru Saito?
Well, given the deep answer that was just given, it's a really minor, small clarification question. But I assume that structure with a boxed element, that structure is also subject to labeling, right? So
no, because it's out of the labeling, I assume, is only in the propositional system.
I see. So for example, the EPP effect, I mean, for example, that's
unlabeled,
explained by labeling, but the subject is boxed, right?
But that's EPP. EPP is for the A movement. It's spec infil. It's not theta marked. It's not in the. Remains in the propositional system.
Mm-hmm. So suppose
therefore
that
it is subject to labeling issues, and therefore you get the ECP, EPP story.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I see, but not that partially moved WH phrase in German, for example.
Well, that we don't know. There's just no evidence about it. I mean, and I assume that I'm assuming that the medial spell out is not subject to sub-extraction.
Mm-hmm.
Don't know the evidence, but I'm just kind of predicting that. So somebody who knows the evidence could check.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
What I'm claiming is that what the theory suggests is that it moves directly from the causal system to externalization without passing through introduction into the derivation, the way it does at the matrix.
Mm-hmm.
So it's either true or false, but it's testable. You know?
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Let's turn to Rini next, please.
Yeah, I have a question on accusatives. So I wonder how you would derive a sentence like, "What did you say? Who did you say was arrested?" Because no WH element seems to be boxed, right? Because there is no spec VP where the WH could be moved into. The WH moves into a spec of infil, but that too is not a position where an element is boxed. Nevertheless, the sentence is fine. So how would you derive a case like that?
What is the sentence again?
Who did you say was arrested? So at the matrix C, look into a box
first thing we have to get to is, who did you say that was arrested?
No. That can be explained, actually.
The next one, then when it moves to speck of C in from the object position, from the box, it's not box, the theta marked
box,
object
yeah.
position moves directly both to the speck of C and to the surface object. And once it's in the box position on top, can be reached by the matrix.
Yes, yes. So you actually make a claim that the merge is simultaneously to two positions? No. I mean, you first move to spec
and move in both ways.
In both ways, yes.
One of them is the outlier, just for EPP languages, or optionally in null subject languages, can go to the surface object. I assume that's kind of an ancillary operation, which can always happen. But the core operations, it just goes the usual way, right to the speck of C and then boxed and gives the instructions of a book.
Yes, I see that. And when you have the complementizer express that, then you fall back on the labeling problem again, right?
Yeah, but we won't necessarily get a labeling problem if it's coming from the object.
No, yeah.
I think it should work. That's why in the null subject languages, you don't have the labeling problems.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
And try it.
Hisa?
Yeah, I have a quick clarification question. So your example 13, of which presidents did you wonder how many pictures of which presidents the gallery was pleased to sell? I just want to make sure where is where. So how many pictures of which presidents is in the lowest phase spec? However,
the lowest one is how many pictures of which president?
Yeah.
That's how many is basically a single element. It's many with the WH feature.
Yeah.
And then comes the noun phrase, presidents of which pictures of which presidents. Well, the object of the complement of president of picture does have a theta role.
That's right. Yeah.
So therefore it's extractable by merge.
Right.
Which gives you the sub-extraction.
That's right. No, there's no problem, but I just want to make sure where is where, so that how many pictures of which president is the lowest VP phase. However, the extracted which president is in fact the embedded CP spec selected by Wonder. So in fact, I am actually do you wonder which presidents see blah, 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 and how many pictures of which presidents? Is that correct? So basically I make sure extracted which president is in fact located in the specifier of embedded CP, which is actually a complement of Wonder, and which is actually different from the standard analysis.
Well, you can extract of which president.
Sorry, of which president.
In these cases. But you can extract of which president from the raised position. And then no matter how much higher it is, it can still be seen. It's boxed. So
but the extracted of which president is the specifier of CP selected by Wonder.
Of president is it's just like pulling out an object of a verb. It's not the specifier of anything. So if I have who did you see, I can extract the object of C. If I have president pictures of which president, I can extract the object of picture, namely of which president.
Where does it go?
Where's it going? The spec of C.
Okay.
I mean, that's sub-extraction.
Okay, so but
Get it.
spec of C is in fact the complement of wonder, but actually that is externalized or pronounced in the matrix CP.
Well, at the
I just
matrix, we don't really know where it goes. Doesn't really matter because you don't. There's a root sentence, so nothing more happens. But
Okay.
at the matrix is just introduced into the derivation as spec of C, and then it deletes its trace in the usual way and can be accessed up above.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you.
I mean, there are a lot of questions about sub-extraction, which I don't think have been looked into. How does it actually work in a lot of cases? One of the cases, the ones that Mamoru mentioned, does it or does it not work for medial spell out? I assume not, but it has to be checked.
Yeah, thank you.
And next is Carlos.
Hi, Noam. I have a simple question for you to see how it works with the, evidently you have been working on the anaphora. Those cases, I think it's around 23, the examples around 23 or thereabouts. Could you show us?
Can we see that?
Yeah. 20 months.
Those,
More like, well, it's easy, we understand it. It's switch picture Mary, I think, yeah. C, okay, 22 then, 22C. So
which
the cases where the middle, it's the middle cases.
the middle case.
Where the WH word, okay, went through, was interpreted, and was merged upstairs. Okay, so it does. The way I was doing it is to go phase by phase. Does that change anything in the system that you are conceiving?
It's basically the same, but here there's no movement. It's just accessing the information.
Yeah, yeah.
So the it's pretty similar if you look at it. Instead of movement, there's just successive application, successive accessing of the lower spec CP. And that gives you the same results, but none of the problems of successive cyclic movement, none of the segregation problems that I talked about earlier. And it also keeps strictly to the principal definition of merge, which has to be theta related. All operations should be theta related. If you have successive cyclic movement, the intermediate stages are not theta related.
That's right.
So it has both empirical and conceptual reasons, but otherwise you can kind of translate one into the other. When you look at it this way, it does raise interesting questions. Actually, successive cyclic movement in some fashion raises the same questions. What's the phase? Is the phase the VP or is it the external argument with the VP? And there's arguments for both, so it's probably both in different systems.
And the second question is related. There are some cases in which the binding has to wait, right? So bypasses. Okay, you bypass a phase or two. Okay, so the binding the principle A has a chance to apply, but you sort of keep leaving for the higher phase. Is there any problem with the new system?
This is cases of principle A in the system that are not phase bound. Yeah, I'm arguing that's normal.
Normal.
That's like, the men thought that it was strange that it was claimed that pictures of each other were on sale. That raises the question that I pointed out. It's an open question about the medial cases.
Right.
the men said that Mary liked each other. What's the status of those? I think that's an open question. We've always assumed that it's barred by Mary. Maybe not. Maybe it's like the moon illusion. We're looking at the wrong facts.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I think we're over even our extended limit. We're in the extended phase here, so I think it might be time to wrap it up. So Noam, thank you again. Very stimulating. Really appreciate that you were here during this very intense time over the last two weeks. So we greatly appreciate it. A lot to think about, many new ideas to work with. The videos will be available soon, and we hope that you will all share them widely and make this available to as many people as possible. One of the goals is to really get this out and have people thinking about it and working in the framework. So we'll send the details of that, and please send that on to all of your students and colleagues and friends so we can get a wide audience. Many thanks to the technical crew. Worked out really, really well. So thank you for that work, and everyone who's here. Really appreciate it. So he said, do you have any final comments?
No, but those two technical people, Akihiko Matsuzawa and Takahiro Ribe, they are helping us a lot. And of course, Asako Uchibori was always helping us. Thank you very much.
Okay. So Professor Chomsky, we appreciate this. Very stimulating. And with that, this lecture series is hereby closed. Thanks to everyone, and wish you all well.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.